I still remember the exact moment I realized my parents had ranked their children. I was 8 years old, standing in our kitchen doorway, watching my mother arrange flowers for my brother Ryan's spelling bee victory party. 50 guests. A 3-tier cake with his name in gold frosting, balloons covering every surface. She'd spent weeks planning it, calling caterers, designing invitations with his photo front and center. 1 month later, I won the regional science fair. First place out of 300 entries. I'd spent 6 months building a water purification system from recycled materials, working alone in our garage after school, while Ryan practiced spelling words with both parents coaching him. The day of my win, I waited outside the school building for 2 hours. Rain soaked through my jacket. My trophy got water spots on the brass plate. I called home 4 times. No answer. Eventually, I walked the 3 miles back, carrying that heavy trophy the whole way, my backpack digging into my shoulders. When I finally got home, soaking wet and exhausted, my mother looked up from her laptop like she'd forgotten I existed. "Oh, sweetie, was that today?" she asked, distracted. "Ryan had baseball practice and your father had a work thing. You understand, right?" She turned back to her screen before I could answer. My trophy sat on the kitchen counter for 2 days before disappearing into the garage. I never saw it again. That pretty much defined my childhood. Ryan was the miracle child they'd tried for 10 years to have. 10 years of fertility treatments, failed pregnancies, prayers, and disappointments. Then he arrived, perfect and wanted, their answered prayer. I came 3 years later, unplanned and inconvenient. The accident that disrupted their perfect family unit. They never said those exact words, but I felt it in everything they didn't do for me. Ryan got a nursery designed by a professional, hand-painted murals of woodland creatures covering every wall, a custom crib that cost more than most people's cars. I got a dresser drawer in their bedroom for the first 6 months, then a bare room with hand-me-down furniture from garage sales. My mother kept everything from Ryan's childhood in carefully labeled storage boxes. Every report card, every crayon drawing, every baby tooth went into archival quality containers she stored in the attic. My stuff went straight into the trash. I learned early not to get attached to anything because it wouldn't be there tomorrow. By the time I turned 10, I'd stopped expecting parental involvement entirely. I packed my own lunches, did my own laundry, walked myself to school every morning, regardless of weather. Ryan got chauffeured in our mother's sedan, even though we attended the same school, just different buildings. I'd stand at the bus stop watching them drive past, my mother's hand reaching over to ruffle his hair, both of them laughing at some joke I wasn't part of. My backpack weighed 30 pounds with textbooks I'd bought myself using money from babysitting neighborhood kids on weekends. Teachers thought I was remarkably independent for my age. Really, I just had no choice. Independence wasn't a personality trait, it was survival. I learned to forge parents' signatures on permission slips, handle my own school registration, manage my own schedule without any adult supervision. By 12, I was essentially raising myself while living in a house with 2 parents who were physically present but emotionally absent. The worst part wasn't the neglect itself. It was the gaslighting that came with it. "We love you both equally," my mother would say while sitting in the bleachers at Ryan's hockey games, her voice bright and false. I'd counted once. She attended 47 of his games that season. She came to exactly 0 of my track meets, even though I qualified for state championships. "You're imagining things," my father would insist while showing colleagues photos of Ryan on his phone, scrolling through hundreds of images. When pressed, he couldn't find a single photo of me newer than elementary school. They had a shrine to Ryan in our living room, an entire wall dedicated to his achievements, trophies lined up by height, certificates in matching frames, photos from every age showing his progression from infant to teenager. The display got updated regularly, new accomplishments added with ceremony and pride. I had one school picture on the refrigerator, held up by a magnet advertising a pizza place. That photo was from second grade. Nobody had bothered updating it in 9 years. I'd stopped looking at it eventually, because seeing my 8-year-old face staring back at me was too painful a reminder of how invisible I'd become. When I turned 16, everything seemed to change for exactly one moment. I got accepted into the advanced biotechnology program at school, a prestigious opportunity that only took 10 students statewide. Full scholarship to a summer intensive at MIT, working alongside actual researchers in cutting-edge labs. The kind of chance that could shape an entire career, open doors most kids never even knew existed. I ran home with the acceptance letter clutched in my hand, barely able to breathe from excitement and hope. Finally, something so significant they'd have to acknowledge me. Finally, proof I was worth their attention. My mother glanced at the letter while stirring something on the stove. "That's nice, sweetheart," she said in that distracted tone she used for me. "But Ryan has the regional baseball championship that week, so we can't possibly drive you." The program was 3 hours away. It required parental transportation and a week-long commitment. She wouldn't miss one of his games, one of dozens he played every season, to give me this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I stood there in our kitchen, watching her turn back to cooking Ryan's favorite meal, and something inside me calcified, hardened into acceptance that nothing I did would ever matter enough. So I got a job at a local restaurant, working 30 hours a week on top of school. Every paycheck went into a savings account I'd opened myself, money for college because I knew they'd never pay for mine. Ryan already had a college fund my mother mentioned constantly. "We've saved $50,000 for his education," she'd brag to relatives at holidays, her voice full of pride. When those same relatives asked about my college plans, she'd wave her hand dismissively. "Oh, she'll probably get scholarships since she's the academic one." Like being smart was compensation for being unloved. Like high test scores made up for having parents who couldn't remember your birthday without Facebook reminding them. Then, 3 months before my 18th birthday, I started getting sick. Bruises appeared everywhere, dark purple marks covering my arms and legs without any injury to explain them. Exhaustion hit me like a physical weight, so heavy I could barely stand upright. Some mornings I'd wake up feeling like I'd been drugged, my body refusing to move properly. I ignored the symptoms for months because complaining had never gotten me anywhere in that house. Showing weakness was pointless when nobody cared enough to notice. But when I fainted during my shift at the restaurant and woke up in the emergency room with paramedics hovering over me, everything changed. The tests showed acute lymphoblastic leukemia, advanced enough that the doctor seemed genuinely surprised I'd been functioning at all. He kept asking how long I'd been feeling sick, why I hadn't sought medical attention sooner. I couldn't explain that seeking help required having someone who'd listen. For the first time in my entire life, my parents looked at me like I mattered, like I was real. My mother cried actual tears when the doctor explained my diagnosis, sobbing into my father's shoulder like her world was ending. She held my hand during the first chemotherapy session, stayed overnight in the uncomfortable hospital chair, brought me flowers and balloons and stuffed animals. All the gestures I'd craved as a child suddenly appeared now that I was dying. My father took time off work, something he'd never done for school events, or track meets, or any moment of my previous 17 years. But now, facing the possibility of losing me, he cleared his schedule to sit by my bedside. They brought me crossword puzzles and magazines, asked the doctors detailed questions about my treatment, learned medical terminology so they could understand my prognosis. For 3 beautiful, painful months, I had parents who loved me. The chemotherapy was working. My blood counts improved with each cycle, moving steadily toward normal ranges. Dr. Harrison, my oncologist, used words like promising and excellent response and very optimistic. He'd show me charts comparing my numbers to expected trajectories, and I'd see my line climbing higher than average. For the first time since diagnosis, I started believing I might actually survive this, that maybe this nightmare had a happy ending. My mother attended every appointment, taking meticulous notes in a leather journal she'd bought specifically for tracking my care. She'd researched treatment protocols online, joined support groups for parents of cancer patients, learned everything she could about leukemia. My father memorized my medication schedule, setting alarms on his phone to remind me when pills were due. They'd transformed into attentive, concerned parents, and I desperately wanted to believe the change was permanent. Ryan got accepted to Princeton in early March, not on academic merit or athletic scholarships. His grades hovered around a 3.2, and his baseball skills were good but not exceptional. He got in because it was his dream school, and he'd applied early decision. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday, and my parents celebrated like he'd won the lottery. Champagne appeared at dinner. My mother posted photos on every social media platform, her joy obvious and unrestrained. The financial aid package was minimal. Princeton expected my parents to contribute $42,000 per year, nearly their entire college fund in a single semester. My mother spent that evening on the phone with the financial aid office, arguing about their expected family contribution, trying to negotiate more assistance. When she hung up, her face was tight with stress. My father suggested Ryan consider state schools instead, places that offered better scholarships. Ryan cried. Actually cried like someone had died. The next morning, my mother sat on my hospital bed with that fake, concerned expression I recognized from childhood, the one she used when she was about to disappoint me but wanted credit for feeling bad about it. Sweetheart, we need to have a difficult conversation about your treatment costs, she began, her voice carefully modulated. I felt cold suddenly, despite the warm blanket covering my legs. She explained that insurance only covered a portion of my chemotherapy, that they'd already paid nearly $15,000 in co-pays and deductibles over the past 3 months, that the remaining treatment cycles I needed would cost another $20,000 out of pocket. $20,000 they didn't have, not if they wanted to send Ryan to Princeton. We need to make some hard choices as a family, she said, like this was a collective decision instead of her unilaterally deciding my fate. I stared at her, waiting for the part where she explained how they'd figure out the money. Payment plans, loans, fundraising, something. But instead, she said they'd decided to stop paying for my chemotherapy after this current cycle ended. That Ryan's education was an investment in the future, while my treatment was, in her exact words, prolonging the inevitable. My brain couldn't process what I was hearing. What do you mean, stop treatment? I asked, my voice coming out, strange and distant. She took my hand, her touch gentle in a way that made me want to scream. The doctors say there's no guarantee the cancer won't come back anyway. You've had a good run with the chemotherapy, and we're so proud of how strong you've been. But we need to be realistic about Ryan's opportunities. Princeton only accepts students once. This is his chance, and we can't let financial concerns about treatment that might not even work long term. We can't let that destroy his future. I pulled my hand away from hers. You're saying Ryan's dorm room is more important than my life? Don't be dramatic, she said, her expression hardening. You've always been prone to exaggeration. We're talking about quality of life here, making you comfortable instead of putting you through painful treatments that might not save you anyway. Lots of people choose palliative care. It's a reasonable option. I'm 17 years old, I said, hearing my voice crack. I'm not choosing palliative care. The doctor said the treatment is working. He said I have excellent chances of remission. My mother stood up, smoothing her jacket with hands that trembled slightly. Dr. Harrison is optimistic because that's his job, but he also said there are no guarantees. The cancer could come back regardless of what we do now. Ryan has been accepted to Princeton, Sarah. Do you understand how rare that is? How hard he worked for this? We can't sacrifice his entire future because you're being selfish about a few more months of treatment. She actually used the word selfish, called me selfish for wanting to not die of cancer so her favorite child could attend an Ivy League school. The cruelty of it took my breath away. After 17 years of giving Ryan everything while I got nothing, she expected me to sacrifice my actual life for his college experience, to die quietly and conveniently so their real child could have the life they'd always planned for him. "We'll keep you comfortable," my mother continued, her voice taking on that false kindness that felt worse than open hostility. "Hospice care is actually quite good these days. You won't be in pain, and you'll get to spend quality time with family before—" She trailed off, unable to say the word die, but clearly thinking it. I looked at her standing there in her designer clothes, carrying the expensive purse my father bought her for Christmas, wearing the pearl earrings she only put on for important occasions. She'd dressed up to come tell me they were going to let me die, made herself look put together and respectable while delivering my death sentence. And the worst part was, I could see she believed she was being reasonable, that she'd convinced herself this was a legitimate family decision, rather than first-degree murder dressed up in financial anxiety. After she left, I sat frozen in that hospital bed for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The chemotherapy pump beeped its steady rhythm. Beside me, poison and salvation mixed together, flowing into my veins, keeping me alive temporarily while my parents decided whether my life was worth the cost. The room felt too small suddenly, the walls closing in while my thoughts spiraled darker and darker. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and started searching. "Medical emancipation minor," I typed, barely able to hold the device steady. Pages and pages of results appeared, legal definitions and case studies and precedents. Teenagers who'd fought for their own health care when parents refused treatment. Kids who'd gone to court to save their own lives. It happened. It was possible. I wasn't completely powerless, even if I felt that way. I read everything I could find, taking screenshots of legal terms and patient rights laws. My eyes burned from staring at the bright screen in the dim room, but I couldn't stop. Every article gave me a little more hope that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to accept dying because my parents decided Ryan's Princeton dorm room mattered more than my survival. By the time sunrise started filtering through my hospital window, I had 40 screenshots saved and a basic understanding of what medical neglect meant in legal terms. My phone battery was at 4%, and my body ached from staying motionless for so long. But I finally had something resembling a plan. I wasn't going down without a fight. They'd ignored me, dismissed me, forgotten me my entire life. But they couldn't kill me. I wouldn't let them. Dr. Harrison came in for morning rounds around 7, and he took one look at my face and stopped in the doorway. "Sarah, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice immediately concerned. "Did something happen overnight?" I tried to hold it together. I really did. But the words poured out in a flood I couldn't control. I told him everything my mother said about stopping treatment after this cycle, about Ryan and Princeton, about how she literally said my cancer would probably come back anyway, so why waste the money? I told him about 17 years of being invisible, of raising myself while they poured everything into their miracle child. Dr. Harrison's expression changed from concerned to something harder, angrier. His jaw tightened and he set his tablet down on the counter with more force than necessary. "She said what, exactly?" he asked, his voice very quiet and very controlled. "Tell me her exact words, Sarah." I repeated everything I could remember, watching his face get progressively more upset with every sentence. When I finished, he pulled out his phone and started typing rapidly, his whole body tense with barely contained fury. "I'm paging the hospital social worker right now," he said, "and you're not getting discharged until we've explored every possible option for continuing your care." He sat down in the chair beside my bed, his usual professional distance replaced with something more personal, more protective. He explained in clear, factual terms. What would happen if we stopped treatment now? My cancer was responding exceptionally well to chemotherapy. My blast counts had dropped from 80% at diagnosis to less than 5% now. All indicators pointed toward successful remission if we completed the full 8-cycle protocol. But stopping now, halfway through, would be what he called medically catastrophic. The leukemia would almost certainly return within 3 to 6 months, probably more aggressive than before. And my chances of survival would drop from 70% to less than 20%. "This isn't a situation where we're prolonging the inevitable," he said, his voice flat and angry. "This is stopping a treatment that's actively working and essentially condemning you to death when you have every reasonable chance of surviving." The way he said it, so matter-of-fact and furious, made everything feel more real than my mother's concerned performance had. This wasn't a difference of opinion about quality of life. This was my parents choosing to kill me for financial convenience. Rebecca Parker showed up less than an hour later, a woman in her mid-40s with intelligent eyes and no-nonsense body language. She introduced herself as the hospital social worker, pulled a chair close to my bed, and settled in like she had all day. "Dr. Harrison filled me in on the basics," she said, pulling out a legal pad. "But I need to hear everything from you. Start at the beginning and walk me through your family situation." For the first time in my life, an adult actually listened, didn't interrupt, didn't make excuses, didn't dismiss my experiences as teenage drama. She just took notes and nodded, asking specific questions about timing and patterns. When I described the spelling bee party versus my rain-soaked science fair trophy, she wrote it down without changing expression. When I explained about the MIT summer program I couldn't attend because my mother wouldn't miss Ryan's baseball game, she made a note and asked what year that happened. I told her everything. The college fund they bragged about for Ryan while telling relatives I'd get scholarships because I was the bookish one. The shrine to Ryan in our living room compared to my outdated photo on the fridge. The 3 months they suddenly showed up for chemotherapy appointments, then the abrupt change when Princeton accepted Ryan. The exact words my mother used when she told me they were stopping my treatment. Rebecca sat down her pen when I finished and explained that parents legally control medical decisions for minors, which I already knew. "But," she continued, her voice measured, "there are emergency provisions in the law for situations where guardians make choices that actively endanger a child's life. What your mother described constitutes medical neglect, not because of her intent, but because of the outcome. If a parent denies necessary life-saving treatment to a child who has excellent survival odds, that's neglect, regardless of their financial reasoning." She paused, making sure I understood. "The courts take these cases seriously because they involve minors who can't always advocate for themselves. But you're advocating for yourself now, and I'm going to help you do it properly." Rebecca pulled out her phone and started making a list. She needed my complete medical records, the full treatment protocol showing what cycles remained, and Dr. Harrison's professional opinion in writing about what happens if we stop treatment now. She also needed to contact the hospital ethics committee because this involved life or death decision-making authority being used against a patient's explicitly stated wishes. "This will move fast," she warned. "Days, not weeks. Every day we wait is a day closer to your next scheduled chemotherapy cycle, and we need legal clarity before that appointment. Are you absolutely certain you want to move forward with this? Because once we start the process, It gets messy. Your parents will know you went to hospital staff. They'll lawyer up. It becomes a legal battle, not a family disagreement. I didn't even hesitate. I'm sure, because the alternative is dying, and I've spent 17 years being the kid nobody fought for. I might as well fight for myself. Rebecca squeezed my hand. Then let's get started. I pulled out my phone and texted Ryan. Need to talk to you alone. Can you come to the hospital without Mom and Dad? I stared at the message before hitting send, not sure what I wanted his response to be. Part of me hoped he'd be horrified by what our mother said, that he'd immediately offer to defer enrollment or take out loans. Another part expected him to side with them, to explain why his education was more important than my life. The message showed as delivered, but he didn't respond immediately. I forced myself to put the phone down and distract myself with terrible daytime television, though I couldn't have told anyone what was on screen. 3 hours crawled by before my phone finally buzzed. I'll come after my shift at Anderson's, around 7 tonight. The message was short and gave no hints about what he was thinking, but at least he was coming. Dr. Harrison returned late that afternoon carrying a folder, his expression grim. He handed it to Rebecca, and I saw it was several pages of typed documentation on official hospital letterhead. He'd written out my entire prognosis in clear terms, the kind of language meant for courtrooms rather than casual conversation. Continued treatment, 70% 5-year survival rate. Discontinued treatment, less than 20% 2-year survival rate. Seeing those numbers in black and white, in official medical documentation, made everything viscerally real. My parents were choosing to move me from the 70% group to the 20% group, choosing to dramatically reduce my chances of living to my 25th birthday because Princeton costs money they didn't want to spend on me. Rebecca highlighted sections with a yellow marker, her movements precise and controlled. This documentation is exactly what we need, she said. No judge can look at these numbers and call your parents' decision medically reasonable. Someone from hospital billing arrived before dinner, a nervous young man with a tablet. He pulled up my account and started translating codes into actual dollar amounts. My treatment so far had cost $47,000. Insurance had covered $32,000, leaving my parents responsible for $15,000 in co-pays and deductibles. The remaining cycles I needed would cost approximately $35,000 total, with insurance probably covering $25,000, leaving $10,000 in additional out-of-pocket costs. $10,000. That's what my life was worth to them, not the mythical 6-figure sum that might justify their panic. $10,000, the same amount sitting in Ryan's college fund. They were choosing not to pay $10,000, and that choice would kill me. The billing representative kept talking about payment plans and financial assistance programs, but I couldn't focus on his words. All I could think about was that number, 10,000. Less than a used car, less than a semester at community college, less than the vacation they took to Hawaii last year. My entire life reduced to a number they'd decided was too high. That evening, Ryan appeared in my doorway looking exhausted, still wearing his grocery store uniform. He sat down without speaking at first, just staring at his hands like the answers might be written on his palms. Then he blurted out, "I told Mom I'd take out student loans for Princeton, that she didn't have to use the college fund if it meant stopping your treatment." Something loosened in my chest for just a second before he continued. "She refused completely, said the loans would ruin my credit and my future, said you were being dramatic about the whole thing anyway." His voice cracked. "She told me the treatment probably wouldn't work long term, so why waste money that could give me a real chance at success?" I asked him straight out, "Do you think your Princeton education is worth more than my life?" The question hung between us like something physical. Ryan started crying, actual tears running down his face. "I don't know what to do," he said. "Mom's controlled every choice I've ever made. She picked my classes, my activities, my friends, told me exactly who I was supposed to be. I'm scared of disappointing her, but I know what she's doing to you is wrong. Being caught between those two things is tearing me apart." Part of me wanted to feel sorry for him, but mostly, I just felt tired. Even now, facing my potential death, he was centering his own feelings, making this about his internal conflict instead of my actual survival. Then Ryan started talking faster, revealing things I hadn't known. Dad's architecture firm had been struggling for 2 years, losing clients to larger companies and barely breaking even. They were carrying $20,000 in credit card debt and had taken out a second mortgage last year. The college fund wasn't really $50,000 anymore, more like $35,000 after they'd borrowed from it for emergency expenses. Understanding clicked into place. They were panicking about money, drowning in debt they'd hidden from everyone. But that didn't make their choice reasonable. Lots of families had money problems and didn't decide to sacrifice their children over it. "Financial stress doesn't give them permission to let me die," I said flatly. Ryan flinched like I'd slapped him. We sat in uncomfortable silence until Rebecca knocked and came back in. She looked at Ryan, clearly reading the tension, and asked if he'd be willing to write a statement about the family situation, about the pattern of favoritism and neglect he'd witnessed since we were kids. He hesitated, struggling with the idea of going against our parents officially, but then he nodded. "I'll write down everything," he said quietly. "Everything I've seen since we were kids. All the times they chose me over you." Rebecca handed him papers and a pen, told him to be specific about dates and events. After Ryan left, she explained what would happen next. She'd been making calls all afternoon, getting ready for the legal steps we'd need to take. The hospital was backing me completely, which meant I had resources most kids in my situation wouldn't. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying not to think about anything. My phone rang around 9, and I knew without looking it was my mother. I let it ring until it went to voicemail, then listened to her voice come through the speaker because I was too exhausted to turn it off. "You're being selfish and manipulative," she said, her voice sharp, "trying to destroy Ryan's future out of jealousy because you've always resented him. You need to accept reality and stop causing problems for this family. Getting social workers involved is just you being spiteful." Her voice carried anger underneath the words, but also something that might have been fear, like she knew what she'd done was wrong but couldn't admit it. The voicemail ended. I deleted it and turned off my phone's ringer so she couldn't call again. Sleep didn't come easy. When I finally dozed off, I dreamed about drowning while people stood on the shore watching, close enough to save me but choosing not to reach out their hands. Morning came with weak sunlight through my hospital window and the usual routine of vitals and breakfast I couldn't eat. Rebecca arrived around 8 carrying coffee and looking determined. She had someone with her, a man in his 30s wearing a suit that looked professional but not expensive. She introduced him as Nathan Williams, a legal aid attorney who specialized in cases involving minors and medical rights. Nathan shook my hand and sat down with the folder Rebecca had compiled, reading through everything methodically while making notes on a yellow legal pad. After 20 minutes, he looked up and told me we had strong grounds for an emergency court petition. My heart started racing. This was really happening. We were actually going to fight my parents in court over whether I got to live. Nathan explained the process in clear terms that didn't condescend. We'd file for temporary authority to make medical decisions to be transferred from my parents to the hospital. Then we'd push for limited medical emancipation until I turned 18 in 7 months. It would move fast because this was life or death. Judges took these cases seriously when a minor's survival was on the line. The hospital ethics committee scheduled an emergency meeting for the next day. That afternoon, a woman named Dr. Patricia Martinez from the ethics board came to interview me alone. She was maybe 50, with gray hair and kind eyes, and she asked detailed questions about whether I understood what treatment involved and what would happen if I stopped. She wanted to know if doctors were pressuring me or if this was genuinely my choice, clearly trying to assess if I was mature enough to make this decision. "I've been making my own choices since I was 10 years old," I told her. "Deciding what to eat, when to sleep, how to get to school, because my parents checked out of raising me a long time ago. The only difference now is this particular choice decides if I live or die, instead of just whether I have clean clothes." Dr. Martinez wrote everything down and asked more questions about my relationship with my parents, about Ryan, about how I'd handled being sick. Then she asked what I wanted my future to look like. I realized with a shock that I hadn't let myself think past next month. Survival had felt so impossible that planning beyond it seemed pointless. "I want to finish high school," I said slowly. "Maybe go to community college, have a job I don't hate, just exist without constantly fighting for scraps of attention from people who are supposed to love me." It sounded so basic when said out loud, the bare minimum of what a life should be, but it was more than I'd ever let myself hope for. That afternoon, my parents showed up without warning, and I heard them before I saw them. Their voices carried down the hallway, along with a third voice I didn't recognize. They'd brought a lawyer, some older man in a gray suit who started talking about parental rights and family privacy before reaching my room. Rebecca must have been watching for them because she intercepted them right outside my door. Suddenly, there were 3 adults arguing in voices that kept escalating. I sat frozen in bed, listening to my mother say I was being difficult, and the lawyer claiming they had every right to make medical decisions for their minor child. Rebecca's voice stayed calm but firm, explaining that the hospital had serious concerns about medical neglect and an ethics review was already underway. The lawyer threatened something about lawsuits and overreach. Then their voices moved farther down the hall until I couldn't make out words anymore. Just angry sounds that made my chest tight with anxiety. Sandra, my nurse, came in about 20 minutes later. She adjusted my IV without speaking at first, then glanced at the closed door and spoke quietly. "I've seen this before. Parents who can't handle the money or the fear or the exhausting weight of a kid being seriously sick. Some of them convince themselves that giving up is mercy, that they're sparing their child from suffering, when really they're sparing themselves from having to keep fighting." She looked right at me. "It's not your job to make their choices easier by dying when it's convenient for them." Her words hit hard because nobody had said it that plainly before. My parents wanted the easy way out and expected me to cooperate by dying on their timeline. Around 6 that evening, Ryan texted me a photo. When it loaded, I saw 3 pages of handwriting on lined paper. He'd written the statement for Rebecca. Even in the small phone screen, I could read some of it. Every birthday party Sarah didn't get. Every school event they missed for her, but attended for me. Every time they chose me over her. The words were messy, like he'd been writing fast or his hands were shaking. At the end, he wrote that he was ashamed he'd never stood up for me before and would testify if needed. I saved the photo and sat there holding my phone, not sure what to feel about my brother finally seeing what I'd lived through. That night, I couldn't sleep despite exhaustion. I kept thinking about court and lawyers and having to prove my parents had neglected me. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up and opened my phone's notes app. I started writing everything down. What it felt like to be the unwanted kid. Walking home alone while Ryan got driven. Buying school supplies with babysitting money. The science fair trophy getting soaked in rain. The MIT camp I never attended. Packing my own lunches starting in 4th grade. By the time morning light appeared, I had 5 pages of single-space documentation, 17 years of being second choice, organized into clear examples proving a pattern. I felt strange about it, like building a case against my own parents. But Rebecca said we needed documentation, and this was what I had. The ethics committee met that day. Rebecca came afterward with a tired smile, settling into the chair beside my bed. They'd voted unanimously to support the emergency petition. The evidence of medical neglect and endangerment was clear enough that they felt comfortable backing legal action. Dr. Martinez had personally called the family court judge to expedite the hearing. Instead of weeks, we'd have a court date within days. "You're doing everything right," Rebecca told me, squeezing my hand. "Speaking up for yourself takes courage most adults never manage." I wanted to feel relieved, but mostly felt scared. This was really happening. The next morning, Rebecca showed me the countermotion my parents' lawyer filed overnight. Reading it made me so angry I could barely see straight. Their lawyer claimed I was manipulated by hospital staff who wanted to rack up treatment charges, that doctors were using me to generate profit, that my parents were making reasonable decisions based on legitimate financial limitations. The accusation that Dr. Harrison and Rebecca were somehow using me felt like a slap. These people had fought harder for my life than my own parents ever did. Dr. Harrison had stayed late multiple times to adjust my treatment plan. Rebecca had spent hours helping me navigate systems she didn't have to care about, and now some lawyer was calling them manipulative because they didn't want me to die. Nathan barely reacted when I showed him. "Desperate people make desperate arguments," he said calmly. He pulled out his legal pad and started walking me through practice questions for court, teaching me how to stay calm and factual even when the other lawyer tried to make me emotional or confused. We practiced for over an hour, him asking increasingly tough questions, me learning to answer without getting defensive or crying. My friend Emily showed up the next afternoon carrying a big tote bag. When she dumped it on my bed, I saw a phone charger, bags of my favorite snacks, 3 magazines, and a card covered with signatures. She said everyone at Giovanni's restaurant where I'd worked had signed it. They'd taken up a collection that raised $300 toward my treatment. It wasn't much compared to what I needed, but I started crying anyway. People who barely knew me, who just worked shifts alongside me for a few months, cared more about keeping me alive than my parents did. 3 days after my mother's announcement, I got dressed in real clothes and Nathan drove me to the courthouse. The hearing room was smaller than expected, just a regular office with a desk for the judge and chairs in rows. I sat next to Nathan while my parents and their lawyer sat across the aisle, close enough that I could see my mother's face, but she wouldn't look at me. My father stared at his hands. Ryan wasn't there because Rebecca said it was better if he stayed out, unless they needed him. The judge came in. Everyone stood, then sat. It started. Dr. Harrison testified first, presenting everything in clear terms anyone could understand. My leukemia was responding well to treatment. Stopping now would be a death sentence within months. He showed charts of my improving blood counts and explained exactly what remaining cycles would do. He stated clearly that completing the protocol gave me excellent odds of long-term survival. When my parents' lawyer tried to suggest the cancer might come back anyway, Dr. Harrison shut it down fast. "That's true of any cancer patient, but isn't a reason to stop treating someone whose disease is actively responding to therapy." Rebecca took the stand next and opened her thick folder. She walked through her interviews with me, with Ryan, with nurses who'd watched my parents disappear when Princeton entered the picture. She read sections from Ryan's statement about every birthday party I didn't get, every school event they skipped, every time they picked him over me since childhood. Then she presented my 5 pages of documentation. 17 years of being the accident they never wanted. The evidence covered the table in front of the judge. pages proving I'd been raising myself since age 10 while they poured everything into Ryan. My parents' lawyer stood up and argued they'd been present throughout my treatment, that my mother had slept in hospital chairs, and my father had taken time off. He pointed to the 3 months they showed up for chemo, like that erased 17 years. Nathan got up and asked one simple question. Why did that care stop the exact moment Ryan's college plans needed money? Why was Sarah's life worth their attention only until it competed with their preferred child's dreams? The lawyer had no good answer, just kept repeating they'd been there when it mattered. If it really mattered, Nathan said quietly, Sarah wouldn't be fighting for treatment in court right now. The judge looked at me and said I needed to testify. My legs felt shaky walking to the front. She asked me directly what I wanted. I want to live, I said, my voice smaller than intended. I want to finish the treatment that's working. My cancer is getting better. Stopping now would kill me within months. I kept my eyes on the judge because looking at my parents felt impossible. I understand they can't or won't pay for it, but that shouldn't mean I have to die. There have to be other options besides giving up on me. The judge turned to my parents and asked if they'd looked into payment plans, charity care, Medicaid, fundraising, anything besides just deciding to stop treatment. My father admitted they hadn't, because they thought insurance limitations meant no other options existed. The judge's face showed exactly what she thought of that answer. My mother finally spoke, her voice shaking, trying to argue she was protecting me from false hope, making my last months comfortable instead of filled with painful treatment. But even she didn't sound convinced, the words coming out wrong. The judge leaned forward. Are you choosing your son's education over your daughter's life? My mother opened her mouth. Nothing came out. That silence answered everything. The judge announced her ruling immediately. She granted temporary emergency authority to the hospital to continue my treatment while the full emancipation petition got processed. She ordered my parents to cooperate with Medicaid applications and provide whatever financial documentation the hospital needed. The ruling meant I could keep getting chemo, regardless of what they wanted. Their decision to let me die didn't matter anymore because the court was taking that choice away. I felt Nathan squeeze my shoulder and realized I'd stopped breathing. Relief hit so strong it made me dizzy. Walking out, my mother tried to approach, but Nathan stepped between us. He reminded her the order included rules against harassment. My father stood behind her, looking defeated. Ryan hovered near the doors, clearly wanting to say something but not knowing what words could help. I walked past all of them with Nathan guiding me toward his car, not looking back. Back at the hospital, Rebecca met us with a stack of Medicaid paperwork 3 inches thick. She explained we were applying for emergency coverage as a medically needy minor, which required proving my parents were unable or unwilling to provide necessary care. The forms asked for income, assets, household details, and required documentation of the medical neglect that brought us here. My hand cramped from signing my name repeatedly. Each signature was another piece of evidence that I was on my own now. Dr. Harrison came by while we finished the paperwork and scheduled my next chemo cycle for 3 days out. He said the hospital's charity care committee would review my case for financial assistance to cover whatever gaps Medicaid didn't handle. He looked genuinely relieved that treatment could continue without stopping, like he'd been carrying the weight of my potential death and could finally put it down. Your counts are still improving, he told me. If we stay on track, you'll finish the full protocol right around graduation. Maybe even walk across that stage to get your diploma. That night, Ryan showed up, and we sat in silence for a while. Finally, he said he'd told Princeton he was deferring enrollment for a year, that he needed time to work and save money before starting college. He tried to make it sound practical, but we both knew what it meant. He was stepping back from the situation that almost killed me. He couldn't go to Princeton knowing it was purchased with my life. "You don't have to give up your future to prove something," I told him. "You could still go if that's what you really want." He shook his head. "I've already looked into state schools with better financial aid. Maybe this is actually better for everyone. I couldn't sit in those Princeton classrooms knowing the tuition almost cost you your life." I wanted to argue, but I understood. I'd spent 17 years carrying guilt that wasn't mine. I recognized that look on his face. The next morning, Emily showed up with folders and a determined expression. She'd talked to my teachers about setting up remote learning so I could finish senior year from the hospital. She'd printed all my assignments for the next month and gotten study guides from classmates. Then she pulled out a calendar with a rotating schedule of co-workers who volunteered to drive me to appointments. People from Giovanni's who barely knew me but wanted to help. She'd created an entire support system from scratch, filling in the gaps my parents left with people who had zero obligation to care. I stared at that calendar with 12 different names on it and felt something crack open in my chest. This was what actual support looked like. 2 weeks after the court hearing, Rebecca came by with news that the Medicaid application got expedited approval, covering most of my treatment costs going forward, plus some bills already accumulated. The medical neglect documentation made my case a priority for emergency services. Between Medicaid and what the hospital might cover, we were looking at my treatment being fully funded without a single dollar from my parents. The relief was so intense I felt dizzy. For the first time since my mother's announcement, I could actually believe I might survive this. 3 days later, a formal letter arrived through my parents' lawyer requesting supervised visitation, full of language about wanting to repair our relationship and work toward reconciliation. Nathan came that evening to review it and explained I could set whatever boundaries I needed. I was under no obligation to see them before I was ready. I thought about it for maybe 30 seconds. "I'm not ready," I told him. "I need to focus on getting through treatment without managing their emotions." He nodded and said he'd communicate that to their attorney. My healing came first. The hospital charity committee met the following week. Rebecca called to tell me they'd approved coverage for all my remaining out-of-pocket costs. After reviewing court documents and my financial situation, they'd agreed to fill the gaps Medicaid didn't cover. Certain medications, additional testing, everything. My cancer treatment was now completely funded without my parents' money, paid for by systems designed to protect kids whose families failed them. I sat with that information for a long time, trying to process that I'd actually done it. I'd fought for my own survival, and won. When they started my next chemo cycle, I felt physically terrible. Nausea and exhaustion hitting harder than previous rounds. But emotionally, I was stronger than I'd been in months. This treatment was happening because I fought for it, not because anyone gave it to me out of love or obligation. The independence was lonely in a way I hadn't expected, because part of me still wanted parents who cared enough to fight for me instead of making me fight alone. But this was mine, this survival, and nobody could take it away or use it as leverage. Ryan started visiting every week, usually Thursday evenings after his grocery store shift. We'd sit in my hospital room talking about normal things like his coworkers and my remote classes. We were slowly rebuilding something that wasn't quite sibling affection, but wasn't hostile either. Finding middle ground where we could exist without the weight of our parents' choices crushing everything. A month after the emergency hearing, Nathan filed the formal petition for limited medical emancipation, which would give me legal authority to make my own healthcare decisions until I turned 18 in 7 months. He explained the hearing was scheduled 6 weeks out, though he expected it to go smoothly since my parents weren't contesting and we had strong documentation. The petition felt like the final piece, legal framework that would protect me even after the emergency order expired. At my next appointment, Dr. Harrison reviewed my latest blood work with barely contained excitement. My cancer markers were continuing to improve at rates exceeding initial projections. "If this trajectory holds," he said, "you'll complete treatment in about 4 months with an excellent prognosis for long-term remission." Hearing that I might actually survive, that I might have years instead of months, made me realize I needed to start planning for a future I'd never let myself imagine. I'd been so focused on getting through each day that I hadn't thought about what comes after, what kind of life I wanted to build once I wasn't fighting cancer anymore. The school counselor called the next week. We set up a video meeting where she walked me through completing senior year through online classes and hospital tutoring. She'd arranged for teachers to send assignments electronically and scheduled weekly check-ins to make sure I stayed on track. With this setup, I'd graduate on time despite missing months. I'd walk across that stage in June and receive my diploma. Having a plan that extended beyond just surviving felt revolutionary, like I was finally allowed to think about a future that included me in it. Emily showed up the next afternoon with her laptop and job sites she'd researched. She pulled a chair to my bed and started walking me through applications for remote data entry positions. We spent 3 hours filling out forms and uploading my resume, which looked thin since most of my experience was waitressing. She kept encouraging me when I got frustrated, reminding me any income was better than none. By day's end, I'd submitted applications to 12 companies. Everything from medical billing data entry to customer service chat support. The process felt good, like building something for myself instead of just surviving what other people decided. 2 days later, I got an email from a medical records company offering part-time work entering patient information. Minimum wage, 15 hours weekly because of my treatment schedule. But it was mine. I signed the contract on my phone while waiting for blood work, feeling like I'd won something important. 6 weeks later, the full emancipation hearing happened on a cold March morning. I wore the nicest clothes I owned, and Nathan met me outside the courthouse. My parents weren't contesting the petition. Their lawyer had filed a statement saying they supported my right to make medical decisions and would cooperate with ongoing care. It felt like too little, too late. This sudden cooperation after months of fighting. But at least it meant we wouldn't battle again in front of a judge. The hearing was quick, almost boring compared to the emergency petition. Nathan presented all our documentation. Their lawyer read the statement about supporting the petition. The judge asked me questions about understanding the responsibility I was taking on. I answered honestly that I'd been taking care of myself most of my life already. This just made it legal. She reviewed paperwork for what felt like forever, then announced she was granting limited medical emancipation effective immediately, lasting until my 18th birthday in 7 months. At that point, I'd have full adult rights anyway, but this gave me legal authority now. Then she looked directly at me. "You've shown more maturity and self-advocacy than many adults I see in this courtroom. I hope you continue to fight for yourself with the same strength you've demonstrated throughout this process." I thanked her and walked out legally free to make my own medical decisions, no longer dependent on parents who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with my life. With legal authority secured and treatment funded, I could finally focus on just getting through chemo without constantly fighting for the right to receive it. The physical side effects were still brutal. Nausea, exhaustion, hair loss that made me feel like my body was betraying me. But it was manageable when I wasn't also battling my family. When I could just concentrate on surviving each cycle without worrying someone would pull funding. Dr. Harrison adjusted my anti-nausea medications, and we found a combination that actually worked. The nurses knew me by name and would bring warm blankets without asking. Small kindnesses reminding me not everyone in the world was trying to hurt me. Rebecca helped me arrange transitional housing through a program for medically complex teens, a small apartment 10 minutes from the hospital where I could live independently with case management support. The program provided furniture, helped with rent, and a social worker would check in twice weekly. Moving out happened on a Saturday when my parents were deliberately gone, some trip to visit relatives giving us space to pack without confrontation. Ryan showed up early with his car. We loaded my belongings, which didn't take long because I'd never accumulated much. My clothes fit in 2 boxes, books in 3 more, personal items barely filled a backpack. We worked in silence mostly, the weight of everything hanging between us. He carried boxes to his car while I took one last look at the room where I'd spent 17 years feeling invisible. There was nothing worth keeping here. No memories I wanted to take. Ryan drove me to the new apartment and helped me unpack. Before leaving, he hugged me. Actually hugged me. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you when we were kids," he said. "We were both just trying to survive," I told him. "I don't blame you for their choices." He left, and I sat in my new apartment, alone, finally independent in a way that felt real and permanent. I completed my next-to-last chemo cycle 3 weeks after moving. Dr. Harrison reviewed my blood work with barely hidden excitement. My counts were staying strong. If this trajectory held, I'd finish treatment right around graduation in June. The timeline felt surreal. The idea that I might walk across that stage and receive my diploma like a normal person. My parents started coming to supervise visits every other Tuesday. We'd sit in uncomfortable chairs around a small table and talk about weather, my father's work projects, my mother's book club. Anything that didn't require actual emotional honesty. They asked surface questions about my health, and I gave surface answers about blood counts and side effects. Nobody mentioned Princeton or Ryan's college plans or the court hearing that stripped them of authority over me. The visits lasted exactly 1 hour. Then we'd all leave, having maintained civility without achieving anything close to healing. I accepted this arrangement because stable felt better than chaos, even if stable meant keeping them at arm's length forever. After 6 weeks of these meetings, I realized this pattern might be permanent, that I'd reached the maximum closeness my parents could offer. I had to decide if limited contact was better than none. I chose limited contact because cutting them off completely felt like letting them win, like proving I was as disposable as they'd always treated me. One quiet evening in my apartment, after a day of feeling mostly okay, I cleared space on the small bookshelf near my window. I set up my old science fair trophy first, the one I'd carried home in rain at age 8 when nobody came to get me. Next to it, I placed my MIT summer program acceptance letter, still crisp because I'd saved it even though I never got to go. Then I added court documents from my emancipation hearing, official papers with the judge's signature proving I'd fought for my own life and won. These 3 things together told my whole story. Proof I'd always been worth fighting for, even when I had to be the one doing the fighting. I stepped back and looked at this little shrine to my own survival. So different from the shrine my parents built for Ryan. Mine celebrated times I'd saved myself instead of waiting for someone else to save me. Ryan texted that Thursday with news that changed everything. He'd gotten accepted to State University with a partial academic scholarship covering half tuition. More than anyone expected given his grades. He planned to study business and live at home to save on housing. When he came by that weekend to tell me in person, he looked different, lighter somehow, less tense around his shoulders. He said turning down Princeton had felt terrible at first, then started feeling like relief, like he'd been carrying weight that wasn't his to carry. I realized our parents had been crushing him too, just in different ways, making him their success story whether he wanted that role or not. He talked about classes and internship plans with actual excitement instead of forced enthusiasm. Watching him figure out what he wanted, separate from what they wanted, reminded me we'd both been surviving the same house, just with different survival strategies. 3 months later, I walked across the graduation stage in a borrowed cap and gown, my diploma clutched in my hand. Emily and her family sat in the audience cheering. Rebecca and Nathan were there. Even Dr. Harrison showed up, smiling from the back row. My parents didn't come. I'd invited them, maintaining the bare minimum of civility. They declined, saying it would be too emotional. Ryan came, though, sitting with Emily's family, applauding when they called my name. I stood on that stage holding my diploma, proof I'd survived high school and cancer, and parents who'd tried to sacrifice me. The audience was small compared to the families surrounding other graduates, but everyone there had chosen to show up for me, had chosen to care when biology didn't require it. That felt more valuable than anything blood relation could offer. 2 weeks after graduation, Dr. Harrison ran my final blood panel and announced I was officially in remission. He scheduled follow-up appointments every 3 months for the first year, then every 6 months after that. But for now, I was cancer-free. I walked out of that hospital as a survivor in every sense of the word. I'd survived leukemia, I'd survived my family, I'd survived being the unwanted kid who had to fight for her own life when the people who should have protected her decided she wasn't worth the cost. I enrolled at community college for fall semester, planning to study social work. Maybe I could help other kids who were fighting battles alone. Maybe I could be the adult who showed up when nobody else would. My apartment felt empty sometimes, that specific loneliness of independence. But it was mine. This life I'd built was mine. Nobody gave it to me out of obligation or guilt or love. I'd fought for every single piece of it, and that made it more valuable than anything handed to me could have been. Some nights I still thought about my parents, wondered if they ever regretted choosing Ryan's college over my life, if they ever looked at me and saw what they'd almost destroyed. But those thoughts came less frequently now. I was too busy building a future to spend much time mourning the family I never really had. I had friends who chose to care. I had a brother slowly becoming someone I could trust. I had a future that extended beyond just surviving to the next day. I had my life, hard-won and entirely my own, and that was enough.